Some upheavals don't arrive with the roar of artillery or blazing red headlines on the front page, but slip in like an undercurrent, its true force only revealed when it crashes into shore. In the world of global energy trade, such an undercurrent quietly began to form in early 2025 when China, the number one buyer of US oil, silently walked away. No official statement, no warning, just a sudden emptiness in Washington's monthly export reports, as if someone had erased an entire flow that once fed hundreds of billions of dollars in trade. For years, American crude oil and massive tankers heading toward the Pacific were a familiar sight. China had been the most eager buyer, placing huge orders, signing long-term contracts, and creating a vital artery of commerce linking the world's two largest economies. Yet in 2025, that artery was severed, not by open conflict, but by a quiet choice, a kind of withdrawal only those watching closely could detect. The question is not only why, but why this way? Because if this were a typical trade dispute, the world would expect fiery exchanges, tit-for-tat retaliation. But here, everything unfolded with a suspicious calm. Beijing said nothing, Washington seemed in no hurry to speak, and the rest of the world could only sense the void through the slow, deliberate shift of energy flows. And that is precisely what makes this story different. This is not just a broken contract, it is a link in a larger chain, part of a greater shift, the reshaping of power balances and the architecture of international payments. Oil has never been just a commodity. It is a strategic lever, a diplomatic tool, and the foundation of a global financial system built on the US dollar. When a customer as significant as China walks away from the US, the ripples reach far beyond the oil market, into central bank boardrooms, diplomatic negotiating tables, and alliances once thought unshakable. But to grasp the full weight of this turn, we need to look back, a time when the US and China moved in step in a vibrant strategic oil relationship, an era when every barrel shipped from the Gulf Coast carried not only economic value, but also the symbolic heft of a trans-Pacific bond of power. From that golden glow, one can truly see the shock when it suddenly went dark. There was a time when stepping into the executive floors of America's energy giants, you could feel a palpable sense of excitement. It was the period after 2015 when Washington officially lifted the 40-year ban on crude oil exports. In just a matter of months, the ports along the Gulf Coast, from Houston and Corpus Christi to New Orleans, suddenly buzzed with life, as if a brand new trade highway had just opened. Massive VLCC oil tankers, their hulls gleaming black, departed one after another, bound for the Pacific. And on the other side, China quickly emerged as the most eager customer, placing enormous orders that sent oil trading floors into a frenzy. Back then, hundreds of thousands of barrels of US oil crossed the Pacific every single day, arriving at Zhoushan, Qingdao, or Dalian. These weren't just shipments, they were symbols of a new strategic relationship. The US had found a vast outlet for its shale oil, while China had secured a more diverse supply, easing its dependence on the Middle East. Two economies that seemed destined to clash had found common ground on vessels carrying millions of barrels of black gold. Even the shock of the 2018 trade war, with its tariffs and heated rhetoric splashed across headlines, only slowed this relationship temporarily. After a few quarters of decline, the oil flow surged back. New pipelines continued to be built, export terminals upgraded their berths, and Chinese refineries still saw American oil as an attractive option in both price and quality. Economic reports of the time often called it a rare economic bond between two strategic rivals. From 2019 to 2024, the market ran like a well-oiled machine. Global oil prices fluctuated, but US-China contracts remained steady. American energy companies relied on revenue from Beijing to expand investments, create jobs, and cement their position as the world's top energy exporter. On China's side, state-owned companies benefited from a stable oil source that helped keep domestic fuel prices in check. It was a golden era, not flashy in the media, but solid enough for insiders to believe the relationship would endure, or at least wouldn't crumble from a single event. But international trade has never obeyed the logic of pure economics alone. Beneath the surface of numbers and charts lie political calculations and long-term strategies that even industry veterans can't always foresee. In a climate of rising geopolitical tension, a single tilt of the chessboard, whether from Beijing or Washington, can alter the entire game. And then, in early 2025, that tilt happened. Not with the bang of a gavel in a negotiation room, but with a quiet disappearance, leaving a void that could not be filled overnight. From that moment on, the story was no longer about tankers brimming with oil bound for the east, but about Texas ports falling silent, pipelines running at reduced pressure, and new contracts being signed with names other than America's. The vanishing of its biggest customer began just like that, without fanfare, yet leaving a deep, lingering echo like a seemingly unbreakable relationship, ending without a single word of farewell. In February 2025, the U.S. oil market witnessed a shift that, at first glance, many mistook for a minor adjustment. Beijing unexpectedly imposed a 10% tariff on crude oil imports from the United States. On paper, that figure didn't seem alarming, especially in a global market accustomed to price swings of dozens of percent in just a few weeks. But for Chinese refineries, it was a clear signal. This source of supply was no longer safe, politically or economically, and within weeks they began turning to other options: Russia, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, countries ready to cut prices, waive tariffs, or accept payments in yuan. This turn happened with a silence almost hard to believe. No fiery editorials, no hardline speeches on television, no declaration of ending U.S. oil imports. Just tankers changing course, new delivery contracts quietly disappearing from the books, and in the monthly trade reports, the China column on America's oil export charts shrinking until it nearly vanished. In Texas, where export ports once brimmed with massive oil tankers, the change was palpable. Berths that used to be crowded were now sparse. Pipelines leading to the docks ran at reduced capacity. Engineers, dock workers, ship captains still worked, but without the familiar rush and urgency. More and more people began to speak of the golden days as something that had already passed. For energy giants, losing this customer was a painful blow. China had accounted for more than a quarter of total U.S. crude exports. When the largest market disappeared in just a matter of weeks, they didn't just lose revenue, they lost stability, the very thing that made a long-term investment feel secure. And in the oil world, stability is priceless. People began comparing Beijing's move to ghosting in personal relationships, when one side suddenly goes silent, cutting all contact, leaving the other bewildered, unsure what just happened. But this time, the one left behind wasn't a person. It was an entire economy. What stunned analysts even more was the way Beijing did it. No threats, no media firestorm, just a quiet exit, leaving the other side to piece together its own explanation. And those explanations, once assembled, revealed a deeper strategy. By cutting back on U.S. oil imports, China sent a signal to other suppliers that it was ready to deepen cooperation, while also reducing dependence on a politically risky energy source. It was a way to diversify supply and, at the same time, promote transactions outside the U.S. dollar system, a strategic goal Beijing had pursued for years. Meanwhile, in Washington, the silence only deepened the unease. The market had lost its biggest buyer, yet political priorities seemed fixed on other trade fronts. And from this quiet, another story began to emerge, a story about how America was losing connections in its own backyard, as allies and longtime partners started exploring detours to avoid relying too heavily on the world's #1 economy. In Washington, the days following China's disappearance from the U.S. oil import ledger seemed almost unchanged. The president still stood at the podium, voice sharp and clipped, targeting the usual suspects, criticizing Canada over softwood lumber, rebuking Europe for wind turbines, and threatening tariffs on Mexico's electric vehicle industry. But not a single word was uttered about losing America's largest oil customer. It was as if that rupture had never happened, or if it had, it wasn't worth making a focal point of policy debate. Yet beyond the glow of political theater, the impact spread quickly. Inside the energy sector, closed-door meetings began circling around the question, if not China, then who will buy this oil? And more importantly, would new markets be stable enough to fill the gap that had just opened? With no clear answer, unease began to seep in, not just among business leaders, but also among America's long-standing trade partners. Allies in Asia and Europe, watching closely, took note of one unsettling truth. If the US could lose a market as large as China with virtually no reaction, who could be sure Washington would prioritize their interests when a similar shock came? That doubt wasn't born from public statements, but from the vacuum of action, a silence that forced others to make their own contingency plans. Even America's closest neighbors didn't escape that mindset. Canada and Mexico, two key links in North America's supply chain, began considering scenarios that only a few years earlier would have been unthinkable. If Washington continued to wield tariffs as a political weapon, then relying too heavily on US ports and logistics would be a strategic risk. They would need their own path, a trade route that could keep goods moving, even if relations with the US hit turbulence. From quiet meetings between ministers and business leaders, a bold idea began to take shape: a north-south trade corridor linking Canada and Mexico directly to both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, bypassing US territory and ports entirely. It was an ambitious plan, but one driven more by self-preservation than confrontation, a way to avoid being swept into sudden policy storms out of Washington. And it was here that the story of America's fraying connections at home began a new chapter, one titled with the names of two of its oldest and closest trade partners, Canada and Mexico. The idea of a north-south trade corridor between Canada and Mexico began as a small topic in quiet discussions, but quickly grew into a strategic plan involving both governments and major transport corporations. Its goal was simple yet bold: to create a direct link between the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, allowing Canadian and Mexican goods to reach the world without passing through any US port. Picture a massive freight train leaving Halifax, crossing Canada on a high-speed rail network, then heading south through new logistics hubs in Mexico before reaching Pacific ports. Or in reverse, cargo from Asia docking at Lázaro Cárdenas, moving via modern rail and highways across Mexico and Canada before sailing on to Europe. Every detail is designed to bypass US transit points, not out of hostility, but as a safeguard learned from Washington's sudden tariff decisions. Trade experts call it strategic insurance for both countries. In a world where tariffs can be imposed with a single tweet, having full control over import and export routes becomes essential. And this corridor isn't just about risk prevention. It also opens the door for Canada and Mexico to become new global transshipment hubs, attracting capital and cargo that once relied on US infrastructure. The long-term impact could reach hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade shifting beyond Washington's direct influence. For the US, that means gradually losing its central role not only in North American freight movement, but also in shaping trade standards and terms. For Canada and Mexico, it's a step toward autonomy and a sign that confidence in the stability of US policy has eroded. But this realignment isn't just happening at the regional level. While North America is redrawing its trade routes, on the other side of the world, another major power is making its own strategic pivot, this time not just in goods, but in energy and finance. And leading that change, unsurprisingly, is China. When Beijing walked away from US oil, it didn't just look for alternative suppliers. It built an entirely new network, an energy alliance whose links were chosen with both geopolitical and financial strategy in mind. Russia, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, each appeared on the list of core partners, not simply because they had oil, but because they were willing to sign long-term contracts under payment terms that bypassed the US dollar. On the surface, these deals looked like straightforward trade agreements, millions of barrels a month in exchange for billions of dollars, or more precisely, billions of yuan, or even direct swaps for goods and services. But beneath that surface, they were part of Beijing's long-term plan to reduce its reliance on the petrodollar, the foundation that had underpinned America's global financial power for more than half a century. At Russian ports, crude oil was pumped onto massive tankers bound for the east, paid for through China's CFP system rather than SWIFT, which Washington influenced. In the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE began accepting partial payment in yuan, a move considered unthinkable just a few years ago. And with Iran, long accustomed to living under sanctions, settling in Chinese currency or swapping oil for industrial equipment and telecom technology was not only convenient, but a chance to chip away at the US dollar's monopoly in energy trade. Strategically, this was a double strike. First, Beijing secured a steady oil supply at preferential prices, easing pressure on its economy as energy demand continued to rise. Second, it began dismantling the most critical link in America's chain of power, the ability to control global payment flows through the dollar. The more oil, arguably the world's most strategic commodity, was traded in yuan, the more the dollar's position in international finance eroded. What's striking is how meticulously this was executed without creating loud, market-jolting shocks. China never declared it was bringing down the petrodollar. It simply kept signing contracts, expanding its network, and letting time do the rest. Like a river slowly changing course, by the time people realized it, the energy map looked entirely different. This pivot also gave Beijing a major diplomatic advantage. No longer just a customer, it became a strategic partner to multiple oil-exporting nations, countries already seeking to lessen their dependence on Western markets. And in the world of energy, whoever controls both the market and the payment system has the power to shape the rules. As new contracts continued to be signed and the share of yuan-denominated transactions grew, a quiet message spread worldwide. The US was no longer the sole rulemaker in oil trade. And as the balance of power began to tilt, other nations, from India to Southeast Asia, from Africa to Europe, saw an opening to renegotiate their own positions. This was when the ripple effect began to spread, wave after wave, far beyond anything Washington had imagined. In New Delhi, Beijing's moves were quickly tracked and analyzed. India, the world's third largest oil consumer, realized that if China could negotiate cheap contracts with Russia and Gulf states, it could do the same. Within months, New Delhi had signed a string of new agreements with Moscow, paying partly in rupees or through barter, trading everything from pharmaceuticals and industrial equipment to agricultural products. For India, this wasn't just a way to save foreign currency. It was a deliberate step toward reducing dependence on the US dollar in international payments. Across Southeast Asia, the push to diversify supply spread rapidly. Countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and even Singapore began seeking more flexible oil contracts, allowing payment in local currencies or via commodity swaps. No one wanted to be trapped in a situation where a sudden tariff or Western embargo could paralyze their entire energy sector. Without public proclamations, a multi-source, multi-currency approach was quietly becoming the region's new operating principle. In Europe, the picture was more complex. Nations there still bought US oil, but their bargaining position had shifted. With Washington losing part of its grip on the Asian market, European partners seized the moment to demand better terms on price and shipping. They knew the US couldn't afford to lose another strategic market, turning price negotiations into a chess match in which Europe now held more leverage than before. From South Asia to Southeast Asia, from the Persian Gulf to the Old Continent, one theme connected these moves: the erosion of absolute faith in America's ability to uphold a stable US-led energy order. Not everyone was turning their back on Washington, but everyone was quietly building an escape route. And in the oil business, the mere fact that major contracts were being signed in currencies other than the dollar was a clear sign the landscape was shifting. Yet while the world pivoted and prepared for new scenarios, within the United States itself, a puzzling paradox persisted, one that cut directly to Washington's capacity to respond when an energy crisis strikes without warning. America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, long regarded as the economy's oxygen tank for moments of crisis, is now at its lowest level in decades. The massive storage sites in Texas and Louisiana, which once held more than 700 million barrels, are down to less than half that capacity. What's striking is that this depletion wasn't caused by war or natural disaster, but largely by a series of sales during periods of high oil prices, meant to cool the market and ease inflationary pressure. From the outside, it might look like a reasonable short-term fix, but strategically, it's like removing parts of your armor just as arrows begin to appear on the horizon. While China has been accelerating its stockpiling, filling national reserves to the brim, and even renting storage abroad, the US has entered a phase of weakened energy defense. This gap isn't just a matter of numbers. It's a warning sign of an imbalance in the ability to absorb supply shocks. In closed-door meetings in Washington, the question, Are we weakening ourselves? Has been raised more than once, but it's often drowned out by short-term political priorities. Some lawmakers have warned that if a crisis erupts in the Middle East or if global oil transport is disrupted, the U.S. could be forced to buy back oil at far higher prices, possibly even from strategic rivals. In a world where energy remains the lifeblood of the economy, keeping reserves low is like entering a long war with too little food. And the greatest irony is that while Washington is busy waging loud trade battles, it may not fully realize that the real power game is unfolding in the oil market, where preparedness, or the lack of it, will decide who remains standing when major disruptions strike. The story of China walking away from U.S. oil is not just a trade incident, it's a single link in the restructuring of the entire global energy order. From Texas ports now devoid of massive tankers, to oil contracts signed in yuan, from north-south trade corridors bypassing U.S. territory, to Washington's dwindling strategic oil reserves, all of these elements combine into a clear picture. America is losing key positions it has held for decades. Three major consequences have already emerged. First, the loss of revenue and jobs directly in the energy sector, triggering ripple effects across manufacturing, transportation, and services. Second, the weakening of the U.S. dollar's role as the primary currency for oil transactions, a pillar of America's global financial strength. And third, the erosion of its position in the energy supply chain, as both rivals and allies build their own networks to reduce reliance on Washington. The most troubling part is not that this is happening quickly, but that it is happening silently. No big declarations, no televised crises. Yet these quiet shifts are reshaping global power in ways the U.S. may find hard to reverse without timely action. In an era of strategic competition, silence is not always a sign of stability. Sometimes, it's the most dangerous weapon an opponent can wield. The question now is, what will America do to regain the initiative? Will it reinvest in its strategic reserves, renegotiate energy deals with more competitive terms, and, most importantly, restore trust among its allies and trade partners? Or will it continue to let the flow of power and commerce slip out of its grasp? This is not just a matter for policymakers. It's a national challenge for a country seeking to maintain its position in the 21st century. And your perspective, whether as an observer, a researcher, or simply an engaged citizen, matters in this debate. What do you think the U.S. should do to turn the situation around? Share your thoughts in the comments and let's discuss the most viable paths forward. If you'd like to keep following in-depth analyses of global economic and political shifts, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Every story we examine today helps you better understand the changes shaping the world of tomorrow. Thank you for watching to the end.